Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 9 of Unit 5, which is Cognition. Today, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit about how we study intelligence, or at least some of the ways we do that. Specifically looking at genetic and environmental influences. So how do we know what differences or what parts of your intelligence come from your genes and what differences come from the environment that you were raised in? So one of the big things we want to look at, whoops, and now I can't move myself. There we go. So one of the big things we're going to do is look at twin and adoption studies. These are kind of the two main ways that we can study intelligence when we're trying to pull apart genetic versus environmental impacts. So the genetic impact specifically, we're going to look at twins, especially identical twins, because obviously they are born with virtually identical DNA. So if intelligence was 100% genetic, they would be exactly as intelligent as each other. Now, when we look at twin studies, basically we know that if we have identical twins that are raised together, they are nearly as similar as on intelligence test as the same person taking the test twice. So if we have someone who has the same genetics and is raised virtually the same, as you would imagine identical twins would be if they're raised together, they're going to be pretty much the same as one person. So if you know any identical twins that were raised together, they're probably almost exactly as identical as, or identical when it comes to intelligence. Now, we do see some differences, though, when we do a little bit different types of studies. So there are also what are called positive correlations when we see identical twins that are raised apart. So what this means is basically where if we have two identical twins, but they are raised in two different families, we'll see correlations between their scores. So we'll see similar scores. Now, they won't be as close as if they were raised together, but there will be a correlation there. So if one of them is scoring really, really high, the other one is probably going to score relatively high as well. Might not be the same, might actually be a little bit higher, might be a little bit lower, but they're going to be relatively similar. There's going to be a correlation there. Now, we also you could look at these kind of things when we talk about adopted children. So adoptive children have intelligence scores more similar to their biological parents than their adoptive parents. And over time, this correlation will actually get stronger. So let's say we have a kid, the kid gets adopted. If we IQ test that kid, IQ test the adoptive parents, we IQ test their biological parents, we would actually see that even though this kid is living with a different family, his intelligence is going to be closer to his biological parents. And as he gets older and older and older, or her, I guess, as he or she gets older and older and older, that IQ will get closer and closer to their biological parents. So there is a pretty strong link between intelligence and your genetics. Now, we also, though, learn some things about the environmental impact when we look at adoption. We can do, again, twin and adoption studies, but especially adoptive studies is pretty important. So we do know that adoption actually enhances the intelligence scores, especially of mistreated or neglected children. So if we have a child who, isn't growing up in a bad home, who is mistreated, who's neglected, or even actually if they grow up in poverty, in a household that's living in poverty, if they are adopted out of that circumstance, their IQ scores will actually increase. So again, this is telling us that there is at least some level of environmental impact, because if there wasn't, it wouldn't make a difference. So when we adopt children out of bad situations, their IQ scores will actually increase. There's also some correlation on intelligence scores between what are called virtual twins. So virtual twins are where we have two children that are the same age but are unrelated siblings. Now, the other important piece is that they are adopted as infants and raised together. So let's say you went out and you adopted two children. They could even be from different places if you want, but we adopt two children. They're infants, and we raise them together as if they're siblings, right? They're the same age. We'll actually see a bit of a correlation between those two. Now, it's not going to be as strong as like identical twins, but we will see at least some level of correlation between them as they're being raised in this exact environment, or the same environment, I should say. Oops, come on. So when we talk about environmental influences, I want to let me move. There we go. When we talk about environmental influences, a lot of them are especially important early on in life. So we see that environmental influences are more impactful kind of the younger you are. So if you're, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, you're going to have more of an impact if you have a bad environment than if you're, 17, 18, 19 years old. So for example, extreme conditions like sensory deprivation, social isolation, and poverty can actually slow brain development. They've actually done this with brain scans where they scanned a bunch of basically babies, and they saw that over time, the children that were living in poverty and the children that weren't, their brains would literally start to look different. Their brains would develop differently. So if we have kind of these extreme conditions, especially obviously, and they're not talking about, there's tough times sometimes. They're talking about, really rough conditions where they're not getting the necessary things they need. And that's going to actually change how their brain functions and then obviously change their IQ. Now, the other thing that we know, though, is that there is no environmental recipe for increasing intelligence. So this is kind of, I think, the simplest way to think about it. Basically, genetically, you kind of get a certain level of intelligence. And you can kind of think about that as like the max possible intelligence that you could have. Like there's a maximum IQ, right, that you are born with genetically. Then what happens is over your lifetime, basically you'll go through experiences that will either help push you towards that max number or will pull you down away from it. So obviously if you have, if you can be maybe really naturally gifted, have really great genetics, but if you grow up in a really bad household where you are deprived of different interesting things, especially as a child, you don't really get to interact with other people. Maybe you don't go to school at all, or you go to a really poor school. You live in poverty, so you struggle with, finding food as opposed to being able to focus on playing and studying and all these other things. We'll see that even though there was this high level of intelligence you could have had, you basically won't get there. So there's no way to increase somebody's intelligence, but the environment can definitely pull that score down. So let's talk about schooling then, because you might be asking, okay, well, if none of these things make you smarter, what's the point of school, or what does school really do? So school is not really about intelligence. There's a lot of different things that are going on. So school is more of something that's going to interact with intelligence to then make you successful later on in life. It's more about building skills than increasing intelligence. It's about building your ability to interact with people, to problem solve, to be confronted with diverse situations, to communicate, right? All of these things are going to be skills that can be connected to intelligence, but aren't necessarily going to increase your intelligence score. Motivation is also a really big, important factor when it comes to predicting someone's ability to achieve. And we kind of mentioned this, I think, before, but obviously the idea of what we're trying to look at with intelligence is how, likely is this person to be successful. But you can't just be intelligent, or you can't just be gifted. You also have to have kind of some of these other skills or characteristics, and motivation is a really important one. So what we see is that motivation is actually something, if we kind of can rank people's motivation or gauge their motivation, that can predict achievement just as closely or close to as closely as an aptitude or a PSA or a PSAT test does when you're younger. Okay, so we can look at and just see, okay, how motivated are these people? And we can compare that to, how well do they score on like an ACT or a PSAT or something like that. And we can actually see that the motivation is pretty much as predictive as the intelligence score is. And the last piece is there's also differences, and this is an important piece of schooling that hopefully gets ingrained in you really early on. But how we look at school and how we look at intelligence is also super important. So one of the things that can be a little tough, especially in this unit, I think, is A lot of us kind of look at this and go, oh, okay, well, this isn't as smart as I'm ever going to be. I'm never going to be able to kind of go beyond where I'm at. And that mindset actually we see is detrimental on its own, and it'll actually cause worse outcomes in the end. So what we know is that if we can ingrain what's called a growth mindset, or this idea that intelligence is changeable, we'll also see an increase in someone's ability to achieve. And this is really, really important, especially for young children. And this is why we can see like growing up, especially if you grow up in poverty or you grow up in really poor schools, can be really detrimental. Is a lot of times what we see is that when kids fail really early on, it basically inhibits their ability to believe that they can do some of these things, that they can get better at stuff. And so what happens is we not only are, maybe struggling to do it in the beginning, but now we also are losing our motivation to do it. And so obviously that makes it more and more challenging. Where if we look at intelligence as this thing that is changeable, it actually increases our achievement. I think kind of the last thing I'll say on this piece is I think it's important to remember the difference between intelligence and skills. A lot of times people think of, if I'm really intelligent, I'll be good at math, or I'll be good at writing, or I'll be good at history or science or whatever. And the reality is that's not really how it works. Intelligence is much more kind of broad and vague than that. You're good at math because you practice it, right? It's a skill that you get better at over time. You get good at English because you practice it and you work on it. It's a skill that you build, and all of those are. Now, some people are going to be naturally better at some of these things, but all of these different things, especially in school, are skills that you build, not necessarily natural ingrained talents that you can't change. That's going to wrap up kind of this piece of looking at intelligence and kind of some of the ways that we see effects, right? Whether they're genetic or environmental. Take a few moments and do a quick summary for me, and then you can move on. Have a good day.